actually been screening the highlights of yesterday's sessions, plenary and breakout. And this will continue to happen at every point that we have a short break. But let me welcome you all to day 2. I'd like to welcome all the board members that are already seated. Let me also welcome all of you, distinguished delegates that are here. Mr. Joseph Eboigbe, Special Advisor, Budget and Economic Planning. He's also here all the way from Edo State, sitting in for the governor. I'd like to welcome you. Thank you very much. So without much ado, let me quickly welcome the panelists. The moderator is Ms. Brown in Nielsen, Editor-at-Large, CNBC Africa. I welcome you. Thank you very much. And we also have here seated the Honorable Minister of Finance, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed. Honorable Minister, we welcome you. Also here with us is Professor Peter Lewis, Director, African Studies, Johns Hopkins University. We listened to him yesterday. It will be a pleasure to have you back. You're welcome. And of course, finally, Professor Doyin Salami, Chair, NESG Board Committee on Research. I'd like to welcome you, sir. And so, let me take it over from here.
Thank you very much for the introduction. We're speaking about sustainable economic opportunities for the next hour and a half. And we are going to encourage interaction from the audience. We want to make this conversation slightly different to the many, many conversations that are hosted across Africa and across the world, in that we want to focus on execution. It's not about talk, it's about the execution and how we provide a sustainable roadmap for Nigeria to move to a situation of inclusive growth with sustainable economic opportunities. I'm going to open to my panelists in the beginning to set out their view of the topic at hand and give us an update on where they feel Nigeria is right now as we transition from poverty to prosperity. And I'll start, Honourable Minister, with your views on sustainable economic opportunities. Where we can take this conversation, setting the stage for the next hour and a half.
Ladies and gentlemen, does this work? Yes. Yesterday we had an interesting day with Mrs. Peter Lewis painting a picture that was intended to be all of us. There is a very extreme sense of urgency, and I felt that I'm sure everybody in the room also felt it. We have a situation where there is an economy that is beginning to go back to the path of growth, but it's also exposed to a lot of fragility. Any external shocks will affect us significantly. We also have this growing unemployment that is really a threat to all of us. We have, on the other hand, also a very large population of youths that are very active and very entrepreneurial. So that in itself is a huge advantage to me, because I think even though we are a country that is resource-rich, but the most important assets we have, especially our people and our youth. And what we have to do as policy makers is to find how we can engage the youth to be productive in the society, to add their contribution, and also to bring that into deciding what things they should be involved in. The youth, for me, hold the key to the future to be able to raise Nigeria from where it is so that we can become another good example that maybe in the years to come will be cited alongside Indonesia, China, and Malaysia. What we're doing now is significant, but it's not enough. We need to do a lot more. So we have to engage more with the private sector. We are doing a lot of engagement, but we have to enable small enterprises to access finance. We have to provide basic infrastructure, especially how for businesses, whether it's a barber or hair salon or a small restaurant or cafeteria or theater, you don't have to run their business. You don't have to run the generator around their costs. So we have to make sure that transportation cost is reasonably low, and also that it is effective and available. This reduces the cost of doing business. This small businesses is what will make a difference in this country. A one-man business that will end up employing 1 or 2 or 3 other persons, that is the solution. Government or even the formal private sector cannot employ the 40% unemployed people that we have right now. So I see this economic summit as an opportunity for us to engage in frank discussions, the things that we're doing right, but how we can round them up so that the effect is felt. The National Social Investment Program is well designed, but we have today covered maybe 9.2 million people, including about 8.7 million children that are being fed. But if you take out the children that are being fed, the number of people that have been enabled to be employed, it's still under 2 million. So that is still not enough. We hope to be able to expand that program, and there's no reason why we cannot be partnering with the private sector, even rolling out the social investment program. We have found out that there's a need to enable as many people as possible be involved in the financial sector. Just helping people to open bank accounts. So whatever it is that they make, it passes through the financial system. Then it enables them to save, and then it enables them to also access more finance.
Access to finance being firmly put on the table, the importance of the entrepreneur, a one-man business that can employ additional people if they have the right tools. And we spoke, Minister, about access to finance. Dr. Salami, if I can get you here to add your voice as we build the discussion and the roadmap over the next hour and a half.
Well, thank you very much, and a very good morning to everybody. I think Nigeria's challenge is well cut out. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about how countries in Asia are taking significant numbers of people out of poverty, whilst we are seeming to dump more and more people into poverty. And so when you talk about from poverty to prosperity, what we speak to, or at least what the theme speaks to, and I suppose is our ambition, is to create a scenario where we reverse that movement. So that's the first thing. However, are we set up to do that? It's going to be interesting, in my view, to listen to the political class as they canvass for votes, to hear what they say about how, if this can be done, how they are going to do it, and in what kind of time frames are we talking about. I just come into this session from a breakfast, with a theme from education to employment. And one of the startling figures from that session says the following. Every year, 1.5 million candidates apply for admission to university. Every year, at best, we do 500,000 applicants into universities, which means you've got every year 1 million disappointed candidates who cannot progress further than where they are. That's graduating roughly 350,000, 400,000 young men and women, and I speak only now of university education. And every year, we reckon that anything as high as half of them remain unemployed. What that speaks to is that in 5 years, you've probably got the better part of 7.5, 8 million young people disaffected, careers not starting, and then we cannot complain about the tensions that that breeds. So for me, I am very clear that the nature of our challenge is well defined. Key question, what do we have to do? And I'm, again, pretty clear in my mind. I've spent much of the last 10 years on the periphery of policy making. And I'm clear about a couple of things. First, it is erroneous in the extreme to assume that the government always knows that there's a problem. Second, when they know that there's a problem, and with all due respect, Honorable Minister, I'm not trying to be whatever it is. When the government does know there's a problem, and by the way, don't forget, there are approximately 800 governments in Nigeria. We tend to focus on the federal government, probably because it's the most visible. There are 774 local governments, 36 states, 1 federal capital, and 1 federal government. So better part of 800. So when I talk about policy making, it's at these 3 tiers. So even if they do know there's a problem, they may not have the wherewithal. We sat in a session yesterday with subnational administrators, state governors, and one of them was very frank that, sorry guys, the capacity of my people to do what we would like to do is pretty weak. And so even at the federal level, some of us think the federal is probably the best, but there are gaps. And so you can imagine how much wider those gaps are below the federal. So problem, may not know the solution. Know the solution, may not have the wherewithal. So this is something we must deal with, a capacity problem, even at policy making and policy execution levels. There's no point saying, oh, just do it, execute, execute, execute. There's an underlying assumption that that execution can be done. Thirdly, I'm very clear in my mind that, and I've said this, some of you have heard me say this, and so if it's a repetition, please forgive me, that Nigeria needs to answer 2 questions very quickly. The first, what role will prices, the price mechanism, play in resource allocation? We cannot for much longer, in my view, continue to run a scenario that is afraid of prices. Prices change. Economics is clear about that. I'm not saying to you that it's all about markets. Please don't get me wrong. I actually do come from an economic school of philosophy. If you take von Hayek's Road to Freedom, that would give you a clear idea of my economic philosophy. But I'm also very clear, markets fail. Just a minute. Markets fail. But that is where governments kick in. And so we must say, what's the role of markets, but also, what is the role of private capital? For too long, Nigeria's governments at various levels have neither been empathetic nor understood private capital. Without being able to deal with these, the theme around poverty to prosperity remains yet a mirage.
Thank you very much. We have focused further on investing in climate after we've heard from Professor Zuras, and again, thank you for the riveting keynote yesterday that I think has set the stage appropriately for the entire summit. Professor Zuras, can I ask you to give us your opening statements as we move further into this discussion?
Yes, thank you. The other speakers on the panel have very ably outlined both the challenges and the deficits of implementation and a general framework for policy approaches and policy solutions. I'm not trained as an economist. I'm a political scientist and a political economist. I think there can be a range of policy solutions to the present challenges that Nigeria faces. Some countries have taken a heterodox approach, combining some elements of government intervention and protection with market opening and market incentives. Other countries have preferred a more laissez-faire, or what some would call a neoliberal approach. Others have been highly interventionist. So we can talk about South Korea on the interventionist side during their industrialization push, Chile on the neoliberal side during their economic reforms in the 1970s, and perhaps Malaysia or Indonesia on the more heterodox side. That's a matter of choice, but I find when we look comparatively, the most critical element is not necessarily which program or which direction was chosen, but that one direction was chosen, that it was clearly defined, and that it was sustained over time to give local and international investors some predictability, some confidence of what they could expect if they committed their capital to fixed assets, if they built enterprises, and if they expanded their commitment to investment. In other words, would they be expropriated in some unforeseen fashion by a sudden currency shift, by a riot that might destroy their business, by a grasping government official that might tax them or demand some kind of payment? If people don't fear a basic expropriation, then they will commit resources. They will commit investment. They'll build out their farms. They'll build out their informal enterprises, and they will certainly commit to formal enterprises. But if they fear that because of property laws, because of political instability, or because of policy uncertainty, that they're suddenly going to lose everything or take a dramatic hit, then they will hedge, they will keep their assets outside of the country, and they will keep their activities liquid, mostly in trade or real estate or other assets that can be quickly flipped. What I find in Nigeria is not that the critical problem is policy choice, although at times in the country's history that has been a critical problem, and not that there isn't a wealth of talent and careful thinking about good solutions. The solutions are out there. I've spoken to thousands of Nigerians over the years. I've read as many documents over the years to convince me and let me know that the thinking is perfectly sound and the solutions are available to us. The problem is a collective action problem. The problem is what political scientists like to call collective action, which refers to the ability of large groups to move together toward a common interest. And here it's a coordination problem in terms of building institutions that operate on a predictable basis and send regular signals, and more importantly, galvanizing the minds and the energies of the average civil servant, the average entrepreneur, and the average person on a farm or in an enterprise toward a particular goal. If anybody had asked this room or any Nigerian or any person who knows Nigeria in early 2013, what would happen if Ebola landed here? It would have been just shaking your head. My God, it's going to be a catastrophe. Look what happened. If anybody had asked in 1999, do you think you could get mobile phones here and sort out the communications problems, you would get a very skeptical response. If anybody said, do you think that in 10 years' time there could be a $500 million entertainment and media industry in Nigeria developed by Igbo traders? You wouldn't get very many people taking that bet. But it's happened. And part of it happened without the state, in the case of Nollywood. A lot of it happened with concerted, focused state action in the case of Ebola or in the case of the telecommunications breakout. So it's been done. On the political side, we've seen catastrophic elections in this country. 2007, which was called by one observer an election-like event. There was no election at all for many people in the country. By 2011, there was a dramatic improvement, and in 2015, Nigeria made history. For Nigeria and for Africa, a peaceful turnover of power, with the loser conceding. Tell me which person here, regardless of how you're feeling about the outcome, did not hold your head higher and stand taller as a Nigerian the day after that election. Because history was made. So it can be done. It can be done in politics, it can be done in public health, it can be done in critical infrastructure. The possibility is here. The question is what conditions for collective action can build this kind of momentum. And what I'll say quickly and in conclusion in my opening remarks is there has to be some sense of urgency from the executive, from the top, some sense of political urgency. It can be an elected leader, it can be a political party. There has to be some effective team with some depth, not just one or two people, but a small team can really be critical that will stay in place for a long period of time. Trevor Manuel, who made significant positive changes in South Africa, was finance minister for 13 years. And he enabled them to pay down their debt, stabilize the economy, and put in place social income support, a social safety net, which has been critical to South Africa. So some sense of continuity, some sense of urgency, and strong signals to people who are potential investors and holders of capital about the policy path going forward and the security of their investments.
Thank you very much, Professor Lewis. So, as Dr. Salami was saying, the challenge is well defined. Professor Lewis has added his voice to say that solutions exist, and we have seen many viable solutions coming forward in the Nigerian economy. But the question not on the minister, we're now moving into a more dynamic panel discussion after the opening comments. So I will ask the panelists to keep their comments relatively brief as we move through the different themes that we need to cover in this session. Consistency, urgency. We have an election coming 2019. Now we know that politics across Africa largely are determined by elections and the economic activity, the underlying economic activity in an election year generally causes because of uncertainty. So here we are on the cusp, we're talking about the urgency, the necessity of consistency of policy. 2019 February, we have an election. How is that going to impact the consistency that we so desperately need for investors to stake their claim and to invest in Nigeria? Minister.
Well, for the past 4 weeks or so, we've been talking to investors, and we've been sending out a message that the President has asked some of us to just keep our eye on the ball, to focus on delivering on the ERGP and delivering on the goals and targets that are set. He has said we should not allow ourselves to be distracted by the elections. So there are a few of us that are simply working towards 2020, which is the life of the ERGP, and also very soon we're going to start developing a longer-term plan. So elections, yes, they have some side distractions, but as long as you keep focused to what you have planned, then you will be fine at the end of the day. We are sure that the President will pass through 2019 and continue as President. So our focus is all on 2020, not 2019.
Dr. Silani, I'm going to get you to enter the discussion on the investment climate and whether you think that policymakers ahead of the election in 2019 will be able to keep their eye on the
Well, I think, yes,
I'm going to give you a chance to interact if you can, just quieten down in the room. Dr. Silano.
yes, I think they can, and I would actually argue they must. Fortunately, the circumstances that are leading into the election, the economic circumstances, especially the global economic circumstances, look to be benign. And by that, I simply mean oil prices are in the right place as far as we're concerned. Provided the noises around the elections don't cost us oil production, then at least the revenue side of the government should not be impaired. And of course, as we all know here, oil goes the wrong way, and then FX goes the wrong way. And then a whole host of things we don't like kind of happen. So my sense is, ahead of the elections, as we're looking at them, as we're looking at the circumstances that surround the elections globally, we seem to be in a good place. But I think it's important that the elections must enable us to have a discussion around, so what next? Politicians must be able to articulate clearly. So in 2023, when the elections after these next ones will be due, what will Nigeria look like economically? At least, what would they like it to look like economically? Whether they get there or not, we'll make assumptions, as we always do, around what they need, but at least let them articulate what it is that they hope to achieve.
Isn't that almost a defined objective? I mean, everybody knows that you want to get Nigeria firing again on all cylinders from the economic growth perspective. You want to get it off the beleaguered 3% growth level and back to the 8% growth level. Isn't that a well-documented target? It's now about how you get there, not so much about the vision.
I think there is a vision thing, because yes, you may have a vision which speaks to 8% growth, but first of all, is that a realistic vision? We're very clear, the numbers are absolutely clear, that if Nigeria grows by less than 5% annually, you will increase poverty. It's not about reducing poverty. So there is, in my view, a vision thing that needs to be clearly, they need to say to us, we should not be assuming it's 8% growth they're chasing. This is what they're chasing. So we're clear about that. Your point about the implementation, I think, is not just relevant, but it's at the heart of it. Now, do we have those who can get the job done, as in round pegs in round holes?
So, Dr. Salome, I'm going to bring Professor Lewis in here, because I want you to give us a very honest account of the investment climate as we finish off on this round of the discussion. As Nigeria is seen by the international community, borrowing from your peer group, I want you to be honest about the perception, because perception is everything. And when it comes to people parting with their hard-earned money, as you made that point earlier, investors need to know that they can invest safely in the country, they can make a return, and they can get their money out of the country. Now, in terms of the perception of the investment climate in Nigeria, let's move away from the Nigerian boardroom, which we're all sitting around today at the Nigerian Economic Summit group. This is the Nigerian boardroom. Give me an external perspective.
Well, I think the external perspective, is this on? Yes. The external perspective is not as straightforward as we might imagine. There are positive and negative aspects. On the negative side, Nigeria, because of history that we all know, is considered a high-risk environment. Some of the saga and travails of companies like MTN give some investors pause in terms of how that episode is read externally. At the same time, Citibank, GE, quite a number of other companies, and certainly many Chinese companies, are doing very well here, and that is not lost on the international community. I think that in the near term, people expect that there will be a political business cycle, notwithstanding the minister's best efforts and the best efforts by government. That's just the perception, because they expect political business cycles almost everywhere. And some of that could happen off budget and in various ways of moving political money around. That's the perception. On the other hand, I think most investors have already built that into they've discounted for that. They've already
built the political business cycle into their...
They expect a political business cycle here, that spending will go up, deficits will rise, that discretionary allocations to settle elections will be made. That's the perception. But they've already built that into their calculations. And one of the most interesting and surprising conversations that I've had in the last several months was in New York, where a major investment bank had an African investment day, and there were a couple of hundred people in the room, and I spent a lot of time talking to people, and both in the panels and privately, even more important, when we asked, what is your biggest concern about risk? I was in clusters of private equity investors, and they said, I worry about market risk. Oh, what about the next election? What about the next president in, Uganda or Rwanda or or Kenya or Nigeria or Ghana? I don't worry about that. And the notion that African markets are being treated, if I can say this, as normal markets and not constantly subjected to the whims and the buffeting of political cycles is a remarkable thing. So that's
But I still do agree that there is a political business cycle that most investors build into their investment plans when they invest in African territories.
I think that's correct, and I think that they do. I mean, we can think back to 2000 when there was an IMF agreement with the new Obasanjo government, and then that was put on hold. It was suspended because they just said, prior to 2003 elections, we recognize everything is going off the rails. We're not even going to monitor you anymore. We're just going to put this on hold, and we'll resume the conversation after May 29th. But the last thing I would say is that whatever the outcome of the election, there is a great opportunity for the next administration to roll out an early plan and an early team and to strongly signal to domestic and international audiences that we have a strong focus on the economy, we have a capable team to manage it, and we're going to go forward on this basis.
We need to touch on competition, and I think it builds very well on the point that Professor Lewis has put on the table. That is capital flows where capital is welcome. Now, Nigeria is also competing with other African countries for that capital. Kenya, Ghana, South Africa are some of the bigger players that have been well documented. Angola is in the fray. How do you ensure that Nigeria holds its own when it comes to competition on the African continent? You have mentioned, Minister, that you've been engaging with international investors, and the message is one of consistency of policy.
What I'm seeing is there's still a lot of interest in the Nigerian market. We are competing, of course, with Ghana and Kenya, but we've seen also investments coming into Nigeria. We've seen investors comparing the benefits they will get in the 4% interest rate in the US. But in Nigeria, they can get 13-14%. So if you're a discerning investor, you calculate your risks and you come into Nigeria. This is one of the areas where you get the highest returns on investment. We find that all the risks, every risk, even political risk, can actually be factored into an investment decision making. So yes, we have competitors in some of our neighbors, but we are not doing badly compared to our competitor companies at all. When we made an assessment of the outflows of investments from Nigeria, of course the elections have an impact on that, but so are also other global factors like what is happening in the US and also in Europe. We find that the outflow of Nigeria was the least compared to what has flown out of Egypt or Kenya as well as Ghana. So we are still reasonably competitive.
I want to bring in the visual here, and I want to talk about Ghana's new airport. Now, we're not going to talk about the funding of the airport, we built the airport. One thing I can tell you is that I travel regularly to both Accra and to Lagos. And if we're talking about infrastructure and ease of access to an environment, there is a stark difference between what we are seeing now in Ghana and what we are seeing in Lagos. It is not easy, ladies and gentlemen, to access Lagos. And you do encounter corruption, as I did just 2 days ago by one of the armed guards in Lagos. So, these are anecdotes, but this is the reality on the ground. And sometimes we get caught at a theoretical level, and we're debating these issues that are intangible. Right now, I want to bring it down to the ground level and talk about infrastructure and the level of corruption that we're seeing, specifically at entry ports to these various economies, and how you perceive that as a competitive element. Dr. Salami, I'm talking about now just that bare bones infrastructure arriving into your country.
Well, what you describe is what we hope we move away from. I'm unwilling to challenge your position. It's what you've experienced. It doesn't help us. And we have got to go, in my view, a bit differently in our review and actions when we talk about corruption. You look at wages, and they're incredibly low across swathes of the Nigerian economy. Indeed, I had cause recently to take a look at consumption data across the Nigerian household landscape. And when you break it into deciles, 10% bands, of the 10 bands, only one band had an improvement in its consumption, in its share of consumption over the last decade, and that's the top decile. So pretty much every band below that has hemorrhaged capacity to consume in favor of the top. So what we're seeing is upward concentration of income. And to the extent that that's the case, and by the way, it's not a Nigeria-specific phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. However, in our circumstances, given the relatively low levels of remuneration, some of these issues around corruption, sometimes we call it low-level corruption. However, if these are your first ambassadors, when people come in, then it leaves a bitter and potentially lasting taste in the mouth. And so we need to go back and review what exactly our arrangement. It's not about seconding special people there, no. It's about a holistic review, not just of customs, immigrations, or any of that. It's a holistic review of the systems of remuneration, reward systems in this economy, and how those fit into aspirations.
As you say, these are the ambassadors. This is the first touch point with your country. They are the ambassadors with your potential investors, your tourists, your visitors.
Yes.
The World Bank, Professor Lewis, in 2016 says that Nigeria needs to create 40 million jobs by 2030 to cope with the new market entrants.
Yes.
Now, Dr. Salami mentioned that he had just been at breakfast dealing on education and jobs. We know that the reason that there's corruption is for the very reason that Dr. Salami has already stated. The wage is low. There's 50% unemployment in the formal environment in Nigeria. There's a crisis at hand, unabated poverty. So my question is, how do we fast-track solutions to create employment? And I don't know whether it is vocational training, what it might be that is going to ease the situation which is getting worse and worse.
When somebody says there is a deficit of 40 million jobs in Nigeria, I think that there's a deficit of 40 million livelihoods in Nigeria. And I keep coming back to this very revealing figure, also from a World Bank study, but that I found quite impressive. And it was simply that if you analyze the Nigerian labor force About 10% of the labor force is employed in the government sector. 3% is employed in formal private enterprise. And 88% is so-called informal or self-employed. What does that mean? Farmers and urban services. And some maybe small manufacturing, furniture and things of that sort. So the question then becomes less how do we vocational training and job services and so forth to get those people into non-existent private sector jobs. And certainly we're not going to expand the public sector to cover those people. But how do we get their incomes higher? And with higher incomes, obviously they can pay school fees, they can pay for health care, they can buy more merchandise, therefore providing a basis for domestic industry. That creates a virtuous circle. How did many countries do this? Well, I've talked about Indonesia. I mentioned China yesterday. In both of those instances, very different systems. One was market-based, one was, at the time, a communist system with a command economy. They made fundamental reforms in the rural sector which enabled farmers to dramatically raise their incomes. And hundreds of millions of people, or tens of millions of people, were able, and families were able to increase their consumption and to improve their livelihoods. So that's how I think about this. And when I think about the critical bottlenecks, once again, we come back to education is important, medium term. That's going to yield returns soon, but not immediately. But if you've got power and electricity, whether it's grid power or off-grid power, and distributed power, to more cities and certainly more rural communities in this country, you would have a revolution economically. Just as the cell phone created higher gains for traders in the street because they were selling time, higher gains for call centers and business centers as small businesses in the cities and so forth. It had a lot of knock-on effects, and it stopped all of us from spending our days driving around constantly trying to meet people, and enabled us to do a lot more business. So the simple answer here is think about what it would take for the average informal sector person in the urban areas, urban services and light manufacturing, and the average farmer to do better. And I think if you can rapidly and dramatically increase electricity provision and rapidly and dramatically increase access to roads like feeder roads so that farmers can get access to markets, you'll see a lot happen.
Dr. Salami, I think we're getting to some tangible points here, and we're talking about electricity provision, microgrids, access to roads. This leads into the rural business climate that needs drastic attention, as was tabled by Professor Lewis. You've been nodding as Professor Lewis has been speaking. Can you add your voice?
There's no doubt, and Professor Lewis has made some very telling points in this last contribution. But if you're going to increase the rural environment,
I'll ask you just to lean slightly more into your words.
Right, if you're going to do significant or make significant difference in the rural economy, one of the key challenges that will have to be surmounted is that of financing. I don't think the figures have changed significantly from when I last looked at them, but in 2017, I think currently there should be somewhere between 35 and 40 million BVN numbers in Nigeria. 100 of those BVN owners, whether corporate or personal, were responsible for almost half of all lending. Now, with that kind of concentration of access to credit, you've got a real challenge on your hands. Because we're very clear, economics is pretty standard in this. People can increase the level of their activity if they can find markets for them, and when they are able to find markets for them, can get support, financial support, credit, access to credit, to be able to do shall we say, more than their own immediate resources command. And so for me, that is an area that attention needs to be paid. Again, Professor Lewis's point about infrastructure. I've seen numbers which suggest that Nigeria loses as much as 4% on GDP growth annually simply because of a binding infrastructure constraint. And part of my challenge is that when you look at Nigeria's numbers, if we're being serious, we really don't have the cash to do as much infrastructure as we would like to, no matter what. And we must commend the government. Highest levels of spending, we can have an argument about effectiveness, but for me, the role that the private sector, local and international, can play if you have the right policies, the right legislative environment, the right regulatory environment, and if we can build a mindset in the, shall we say, deep state, in other words, the civil service, that the private sector is not nearly as monstrous as sometimes they are made to look. You can begin to see 4 or 5 years down the road significant investments coming in FDI as opposed to FPS instead of portfolio investments. Imagine if Nigeria today were able to take $30 billion into roads, railways, power. It's not, it's not inconceivable. But the circumstances, and Professor Lewis made the point when he spoke about PIGB, the Petroleum Industry Bill, that people are interested. But the thing is, those things that are missing, that we need to fill in the gaps as to assure set.
So, Minister, I want to ask you whether the focus is now going to shift back to the oil industry. I think, I'm a farmer's daughter, so I speak confidently about how tough farming in Africa is. It is not an easy business, and if you're a subsistence farmer out there, trying to commercialize your business is a very, very difficult thing to do when you talk about access to finance and access to markets. But now that we've got a higher oil price, are we going to see the dynamics shifting back to the oil industry and less attention being paid to the rural investment or the rural business environment, to farmers, because we're back in safe territory, specifically for an economy like Nigeria?
We're not shifting away our attention from diversifying economy, from growing agriculture, as well as mining, as well as also ensuring that the right infrastructure are being rolled out to support businesses, because we know that what happens in the oil industry, the pricing is not within our control. And so it is high today, tomorrow it could go low again. And besides, we also are predisposed to disruptions also in production. Even though we have a handle on that now, but what happens in the production industry? So we're not losing sight of the fact that we need to stay focused on growing the other sectors of the economy, taking ourselves away from depending on the oil and gas industry. But of course, oil and gas industry is important, and what we're trying to do is revenues that are coming now out of oil and gas are being invested in other sectors that are more sustainable in terms of growth.
Has the government set timelines when it comes to the rural business environment in terms of infrastructure rollout, potentially supporting microgrids to ensure stable supply of electricity?
Well, we have in the ERGP have some clear targets, as have been said, and what we have set is to be able to attain 10,000 megawatts by the year 2020. And we started out with 3,500 megawatts, we're at 7,200.
So you're on target to achieve your
target, and we feel that we will also actually surpass the target that is set. We also have plans to concession the 4 major airports in the country. There are some major rail projects that are already either started or financing and secured, and therefore feasibility studies are being undertaken to carry them through. There are a lot of major road works that are going on right now. Some of them, we have private investments in doing those roads. 3 major road projects that will be tolled, so investors are part of that. There's also a new road trust fund that we are working on right now that enables businesses to choose a road that they have interest in, build it to to specification that is agreed, and then they recover their cost through tax credits going forward. And we're doing that because we know that government, like you said, the deficit is very, very large, and there's no way government can finance all of the infrastructure. So we're trying to look at different ways to bring in private capital to match government resources so that more can be done.
And just before I come to Professor Lewis, the level of trust between the private sector and the government, how is that holding up in the current environment?
Well, let me say that when you see a situation where a private sector actually elects to build a major road and depends on government to grant tax credits for it in the future, when the government builds a fund and you see private sector investors coming in to match, to invest in the fund that government has floated, it's a sign of comfort between with what government is doing, and it's a sign that is saying we have confidence in what you're doing. Confidence has been building up gradually, and it's picked up momentum both locally as well as internationally.
Professor Lewis, let's talk a little bit more about innovation and entrepreneurship, best practice. Draw from some of those examples that you've alluded to in terms of how policy can make innovation kickstart an economy. And you spoke about M-Pesa a moment ago. You spoke about mobile phone has done for banking across the African continent. Now, when we have these discussions across Africa and across the world about Africa's progress, sometimes the fact that we don't have legacy infrastructure in many of our territories is a good thing, because we're going to use technology to leapfrog the developed world solutions. So talk to me about how we can really get that culture of innovation and entrepreneurship vibrant and ignited in Nigeria.
Well, it's happening here already. I spend a fair amount of time in Lagos, and Lagos is, as everybody knows, unlike the rest of the country. It's its own separate economy. 22 million people, plus the greater region. It's one of the largest megacities in Africa and even globally. And every time I'm in Lagos, it's stunning to see the new bridge from Ikoyi to Lekki. Lekki 10 years ago was beaches and a few local markets. Now it's a city with, I don't know, 500,000 people, 1 million people? I wouldn't know. It's hard to count, with shopping centers and infrastructure, and it's stunning to see. I went to Social Media Week last year in Lagos, 300 people in the audience, younger people, talking to a public representative of the police service about a new app for online engagement with the police, complaints about police service and so forth, and a very forthcoming, not defensive, response from the police service.
So you're seeing all these positive signs, as do we all within the environment.
That's
but
right.
why is it not translating into poverty alleviation, into jobs and a vibrant, growing economy, rather than, as Dr. Salami was saying, and I'm going to rephrase what he said, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer?
I was at a conference a couple of years ago with Kenyans, South Africans, and Nigerians. It was about the 3 pivotal states in Africa. And it was striking to me because the South Africans sort of were just looking at the table and shaking their heads. They were crying in their beer. They were not happy about the course that their country was going in. The Kenyans...
We dried our tears slightly at this juncture.
The Kenyans surprised me because their attitude was, our political class is bankrupt. They're up to all kinds of shenanigans. There's ethnic violence and corruption. But we're doing business. We've got breakout apps and ICT innovation. We've got online finance. We've got all kinds of schemes going. And we're able to do business and move forward and develop our enterprises. And you get some of that spirit in Lagos. There's lots of entrepreneurship bubbling up. I even know former students who are running farms in Bochi and other places. So it's not just in Lagos. There's young people who are applying their energies to new enterprise and creating value in this economy. But, you know, they are constrained by uncertainty and by the environment. They hedge, they keep it relatively liquid and relatively flexible, and they don't feel that there's an overall environment where they can really break out. So I think that's the problem and that's the constraint, is to create a certain kind of institutional and political breakout where people say, okay, now we can do business, let's cut this.
Because we know the rules of the game.
Because we know the rules of the game. And they, you know, you talk to even, let's just take the oil companies. The petroleum industry bill was on hold or in discussion for almost a decade. The oil companies were sitting there going, look, we would prefer low taxes, but we can operate in a high tax environment. Just give us the number. We have the spreadsheet ready, just give us the number, tell us what the bill is going to say, and we'll plug it into our models and we'll figure out how to do business.
So there we go, Dr. Salami. It's about understanding the rules of the game, no matter how complicated they are, just knowing that they are set and they're not going to change. And perhaps that's the appropriate point for us to open to the audience. Some words from you on policy framework. You've mentioned it repeatedly during our conversation this morning about how important the regulatory environment is, policy certainty. Let's get to that point where the rules of the game don't change. And I think we can take heart from what the Honourable Minister was saying, in that there is a focus in the current administration to get on with the job, to ignore the politics, and to make sure that Nigeria moves from success to success, from stability to stability, from poverty to prosperity.
Yeah. I think it's, you know, pretty rudimentary to say that the regulatory environment really must be one that you can understand, and where possible, you are able to predict what's going to happen next. Yeah, there's a lot out there. I think Professor Lewis mentioned MTN and the issues around that. My view is pretty simple, that we do need a regulatory philosophy that understands the need for growth, urgent need for growth. That is not to say that it must condone or in any shape or form acquiesce to illegalities, but we need a regulatory environment where it's not first and foremost about revenue raising. Revenue raising is very important, but if you're raising revenue at the expense of output, then you do so at the expense of jobs, and, funny enough, at the expense of future capacity to raise revenues. For me, there are some things that are sort of heart-gladdening. You look at the National Assembly and some of the bills, some executive, some from the House, from the National Assembly, that are going through. And one of the things that I am seeing across a whole raft of bills, especially around infrastructure, is that thing which says legislation on one side, policy on another side, regulation, very clearly defined buckets. In my view, the legislative part begins to give more confidence to private investors who know that the point that Professor Lewis made earlier about unexpected expropriation. You just don't put your money in long-term things because you worry that the next guys who come may throw you out of it. But please, let's also appreciate it's not just at the federal level. These things have got to percolate to subnationals, because we are usually in danger of holding the federal government to standards that we do not apply to the states. And in my view, they probably have the capacity for even bigger damage than some of what we speak to. So for me, there's no, it's a sine qua non. You do need a regulatory environment that we can understand its philosophy, what's going to happen next, and actually be confident in it.
But it's not just at the federal level. Let me pick up there, Honourable Minister, in terms of filtering regulation policy down through the different layers of the Nigerian economical thoughts, and then please signal if you would like to ask questions at the stage. I just need a hand. We'll deploy a roving mic. Thank you very much, sir. Your second. Minister.
This administration, I think, more than any other, has engaged more closely with the states. Every month, we have a meeting chaired by the Vice President with all the state governors, either present or represented by, mostly themselves they come, but where they don't come, they're deputy governors. And policy issues are discussed in those meetings. When the Federal Executive Council takes a decision, it's taken to also, some of the decisions are taken to the Governors Forum first before it even comes to the federal. So we have their buy-in so that they understand that the implementation has to be also done with them. And there are some laws that were passed, or some policies that were passed, that we have encouraged them to domesticate, to also pass similar policies or legislations so that implementation will be seamless. And we also form some common bodies where, like the tax tribunal, for example, is made of both Federal Inland Revenue Service as well as the state Inland Revenue Services. There's a Competitiveness Council, the Ease of Doing Business Council, several such efforts that are in partnership with the states.
Right, as we open to the audience, we're talking about sustainable economic opportunities as a panel. We've touched on investment climate. We've touched on competition, rural business climate, entrepreneurship and innovation. We've spoken about infrastructure and access to finance. The gentleman in the back, sir, if you could go first. I'll take 3 questions at a time. We'll get the panel to answer. Please keep your questions brief and make sure that they are targeted or set to the appropriate person. Thank you, sir. Could we get a roving mic?
All right, thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel Tarifa, Management Consultant. I run a private practice. I'll direct it to Professor Peter Lewis because he seems to be very knowledgeable at Nigeria, and that fascinated me. There's a force, a third force. I've been looking for the reference, and if I find it, I'll share it. It's by a Malaysian, I think, professor, who said that there's a third force in Nigeria, apart from the private sector, the public sector, and I think we're not talking about that force, and I'll explain why, is the religious sector. Now, this sounds a bit sensitive because religion is sensitive, but let me give you the numbers. More than 50% of Northerners, of which I'm one, are going to vote next year on the basis of religion. I live in Lagos. There are more churches than boreholes, schools, hospitals combined. It's a very serious issue. I know it's sensitive, we don't want to talk about it, but less than 1% of the people here are non-religious. In other words, apart from, Nigerians are non-religious. It means it's a serious issue. We have to, how do you think? We need to talk to that sector because people listen there. So even some of us pay our taxes there 10% every month and we don't default. How much more of FIRS and co? So if you want to talk to Nigerians, you have to talk to them through the language of religion. Now, I'm not saying we should start a religious debate or what, that's not why I'm here. I'm talking about education. I'm talking about employment. I mean, if you told all the churches, you know what, guys, if you don't turn your halls to classrooms and vocational training centers between Monday and Friday, I'm going to start having discussions with you and employ the unemployed people among you to teach these 8 million kids that are out of school. That looks like a very practical, low-hanging fruit we can get working.
Thank you. I think we're going
That's
to
my
pick up on that in just 1 minute. Sir, can I take your question? Could we get a roving mic to the front here, please? Could I have a roving mic in the front? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Frank Ayubugu. Firstly, to Professor Lewis, and this will be very quick. I'm not exactly sure if you were to ask people today that simply on the basis of the free and fair elections of 2015, whether there will be a preponderance of Nigerians who believe there will be a free and fair election in 2019. That's just aside. My question is for the Honorable Minister of Finance. And it's to ask, is the government aware? Because you say that you engage the private sector and that there is still interest in investment in Nigeria. The record that I have suggests that for second quarter 2018, in terms of FDI, Nigeria had just about $300 million. And for the whole of last year, just about $1 billion. Second quarter 2018, Egypt attracted 10 times what we got into its energy sector alone. So is the government aware that until very recently, investors and private sector people were essentially of the view that this government has a pretty damning view about private capital, and that situation has been worsened by the government's attitude towards MTN. And I just give you one more.
Very briefly, sir.
Very briefly. On the 8th of October, and we had a sizable Nigerian delegation, we're in London for the Financial Times Africa Forum. Every question that was asked of me there was simply, after MTN, which is the next company to be hit in Nigeria? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
My name is Engineer F.C.O. Golo. My question is directed to the Honorable Minister of Finance. I want to congratulate the government for all they are doing in developing the country and in fighting corruption. But I also know that we have a Fiscal Responsibility Act, which primarily aims at ensuring that you do not award any jobs where you don't have the money to pay. Also, many contracts have some penalties for non-execution and non-performance, which you levy the contractors if they don't do well. But it also says that for well-performed projects, the interim certificates must be paid within 1 month. Some few allow for 2 months. But generally, governments do not keep their own in this country. The contractors, when they do not do well, are normally punished and other things. But governments, 6 months, they may not pay their bill. 1 year, they may not pay their bill for 12-month contracts.
So I'm going to ask you just to clarify your question.
Okay. So basically, what I'm asking is, can the government, can the president pass an executive order to say that all certificates issued for jobs done in this country and for supplies done in this country must be paid within 30 days to help?
Thank you very much, sir. I'm now going to go to my panel. Professor Lewis, we're going to start on the third sector, the religious sector, and whether we should take that. I'm going to ask you to settle down. I'm going to take more questions from the audience. Please pause. Thank you. All right. Professor Lewis, the religious sector.
Nigeria. We know that it's a very interesting question, and it requires some thought. We know how pious and how religious Nigerians are in all of their faiths. And as I see it, the religious sector really can be thought about in 3 ways. One, as a source of values. Second, as a provider of services, because there are many social services and educational provisions that are provided through churches and mosques across the country. And third, frankly, as a business sector. If one looks at the size and scale of some of the large churches, particularly in Lagos, Ibadan, which is an area I know better, clearly, and we know from the headlines, there's a lot of money going into those enterprises. So then the question becomes, how can those enterprises and those institutions, which are so important to the community, add value to the development enterprise. Direct values toward innovation, enterprise, community solidarity in ways that are positive for the economy. Provide social services in ways that help people to get jobs and maintain some safety net in difficult times. And use their resources in responsible ways that further social purposes and economic growth. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I do think that the speaker, the participant who raised the question, has asked the right questions, that it is a very important segment of this society and this economy, and engaging with clerics and engaging with the mosques and the churches is an important dimension of not just politics, as we know, but also economic development. The second question, which can be quickly answered, can we expect a free, fair, credible election in Nigeria in 2019? I hope so. Professor Atahiru Jega, who very ably led the INEC for 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, in 2 elections, he regularly promised an election that would not be perfect. And he delivered on his promises. This was one of his favorite lines that I heard dozens of times. The election won't be perfect, but we want it to be free, fair, and credible. We know that neither the 2011 or the 2015 election was perfect, but they were credible. They were accepted by the broad mass of the Nigerian public, and they were dramatic improvements on previous elections in Nigeria and in the Fourth Republic. And we certainly hope that his successors in INEC and the culture of electoral vigilance that has been established among the citizenry and the voters can carry forward for a peaceful and credible.
Professor Lewis, I'm going to take you to the Honourable Minister. You've got 2 questions back to back. The first one is whether the government has a realistic view of the private capital environment towards Nigeria and whether it has in fact acknowledged that damage has been done. And the MTN example was taken.
The MTN incident was a very damaging one for us, and that was one of the reasons why we have been out trying to engage investors. But you see, there's a tendency for even businesses, big businesses, to take regulation and government for granted. Only after that incident happened, all of the information that the CBN had been trying to get for 2 months actually came out. And now, I think they are to a point when they have almost solved the problem. And this is information that the CBN governor had personally met with MTN, with the 2 banks involved, and had asked them to provide the information. That is, it was an audit that took place over the course of 2.5 years, and the auditors were not satisfied with some information. They queried and they asked for additional information. It didn't come until that measure unfortunately happened, which was negative for us, but which now is being sorted out. And we're very because of it. We have been engaging investors and trying to explain what has happened. The other thing is there is no incident where in the recent where an investor is not able to take out the funds. Yep. So our investors have tested.
So the foreign exchange crisis is way behind you.
Because of the stability now in the foreign exchange market, the turnaround time from request to getting resources is very, very tough, and this standard is expected. So we are trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We're continuously discussing with the monetary authorities. There will be no company next after MTN, because you said who's next. Nobody is next, because we just can't afford for this kind of incidences to happen. Let me move to the question raised in respect of the fiscal responsibility. I really wish that I don't even have to ask for an executive order that after every 30 days of an invoice being raised that I can just. But the reality is we inherited huge debts. Some of them are dating back to 2004. And we have to take them into account. And we have this national attitude, and it's not just government alone, that when you do a road project in Zone A, you must be seen to do it in B, C, and D as well. to standards that are pre-agreed so that they can get tax credits and returns, will address some of these issues. We have brought to bear a lot of discipline in terms of funds management. We do cash planning on a very routine basis so that we sequence what we need to pay. But the obligations are large. We are trying to put some off into a promissory notes issuance process to reduce the burden, but there's a process to that which involves the National Assembly and a lot of due diligence. So we're trying to be careful going forward, but we still can't address all of the debt overhang that we have from previous contracts. So we're just taking the bit that we can and then pinning some off into debt notes.
Right, I'm going to take another 3 questions. I do want to take one from this side of the room, please, and then you, sir. Thank you, and then I'll take you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Ayo Adegboye, I work for BCX. 2 submissions. Honorable Minister, thanks for the good effort in terms of financial inclusion as well as empowerment. But according to Professor Louis yesterday, he was talking about let's shift focus from job to livelihood. And talking about livelihood, we're talking about the formal and informal sector as well as SME. We are aware the next growth engine will come from SME. But what effort are we putting in place in terms of compelling the large corporate entities doing business with SME? And I'm saying this with particular reference. We often see that the conditions for SME to do business with large entities include you're not going to be paid until after 75 to 90 days. You need to bring evidence of tax payments. You need to bring this, you need this, you need this. Whereas when a large entity, corporate entities deal with another large corporate entities, most of these waivers could be rested. You can be sure that there will be a lot of waivers. So we need to see some policy and encouragement from the government to compare the formal sector, especially the large corporate entities, to do business with SME by giving a couple of waivers. That's the number one. Number 2 is we cannot run away from the infrastructural deficiency. It will always be there. But there are a couple of leapfrogs that could actually take us. Again, Professor Liu was talking yesterday about a country that within a decade, it decided to focus on growing coffee. And within 10 years, it became the 2nd largest producer of coffee. In our own case, maybe we may not focus on coffee or agriculture for now, but we're talking about innovation, because we're talking a lot about innovation. This is another sector that actually, if you focus on, irrespective of the infrastructural decadence we're seeing today, we could leapfrog. And we're talking about homegrown technologies, where we could turn this to knowledge-based economy. We've seen a lot of young innovators, especially in fintech, developing a couple of applications that could actually aid the cost of doing business in Nigeria today. So what support do we get from government to support the young tech entrepreneurs to actually see them growing? Because we've seen most of the investors, local investors, don't invest in technology. They rather invest in what they could see, infrastructure, the tangible assets. So what deliberate effort can we get from government to encourage homegrown technology? So in another 5-10 years from now, we could begin to see this, we could begin to see a knowledge-based economy where we could develop some applications or technology from Nigeria that potentially.
Thank you very much for that submission, sir. Thank you. Can we please pass the mic to the gentleman in the middle?
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Uche Uwaleke. I'm a professor of capital markets at the Nasarawa State University, Kefi. My question is to the Honorable Minister of Finance. She sounded so confident that the administration will continue beyond May next year. While I share in that optimism, we also know that it's difficult in reality to get a probability of 1. So my question is, what safeguards are in place by the government to ensure that the ERGP survives beyond May in the unlikely event that the president doesn't continue next year? So is the government thinking of getting a law to back up the ERGP, just as we have in Pakistan, where the economic policy is supported by law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll take a final question from the gentleman here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Mansour Ahmed. I work with the Dangote Group. In this discussion, and indeed in all previous discussions at this summit, one thing comes out very clearly, that one of the key inhibitors to effective execution of policy is not that we don't have good policies or we don't have enough of them, but that we seem to have a disconnect between the intentions and desires of policymakers and the behavior of policy executors, particularly civil servants that are responsible for facilitating policy execution. Now, I'm aware that several times, and in the past, government does introduce some initiatives to improve what they call public service delivery. But it seems to me that there has been no attempt to interrogate and extensively what the cause of this disconnect between the intentions of policymakers and the behavior of people executing policy. And indeed, as has been pointed out, I think by Dr. Salami, often it is the behavior of these people at the level of execution, that is, when they actually face the receiver of public service, that we begin to have problems in this country. So is there any way, and I ask all the panelists, is there any way in which this issue can be interrogated in depth with a view to determining why is it we have good policies, we have all the good policies basically, but when it comes down to execution at the lower level, it fails. I know we've talked about the compensation package for people at the lower level, but I think it goes beyond the compensation package. Is there a possibility that we can take a real in-depth analysis of this issue and try to find a solution? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've got 9 minutes left before we break, and I'm now going to take the opportunity to move to concluding comments. I'm sorry, I'm not going to take any more questions from the audience. I'm going to ask you to work these 3 questions into your responses as we move to your concluding comments on sustainable economic opportunities. And Professor Lewis, I'm going to start with you. If we can touch on different rules for SMEs versus large corporates in order to foster small, medium enterprises, on how we can elevate the techpreneur so that technology allows us to leapfrog some of the legacy issues that we may be facing at the moment. We also need to touch on continuity should there be a change in government in the 2019 election, especially when it comes to the economic recovery plan, and the fact that you mentioned so clearly the rules of the game need to stay the same, and the economic recovery plan would be at the center of documentation of policy making in terms of lifting Nigeria out of its current status. And then we also need to talk about the disconnect between the policymakers, the intentions of the policymakers, the disconnect between those who actually execute the policies themselves, and how we can change up to ensure that there's consistency from intention to execution. It's all yours, sir.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I think the response to the question about technopreneurs and small and medium enterprises, part of it was provided by the Honorable Minister of Budget and Planning yesterday, and this notion of labs. And I think taking forward that idea of consultative groups that just focus on a very specific industry or sector and focus on a simple question. How can we get SMEs to invest and prosper? What are the conditions that are now lacking? What would need to change? Access to finance, infrastructure is what we've emphasized here. There may be other elements in the regulatory environment, and really unpack that in a serious way and think about how to do that. Similarly with technopreneurs, I think we have good evidence from across Africa that even in difficult regulatory and institutional and governance settings, people can do things. There are incredible innovations coming out of Uganda, out of Rwanda, out of South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana. Those are the most prominent countries, but there are awards, and I see other things coming out of Senegal and so forth. And each of those countries that I've mentioned has their baggage, they have their problems. And yet there are opportunities for people to mobilize finance and get their products out. And so again, a industry-focused lab or consultative group could, I think, help to sort through that. On implementation, I won't necessarily go into agriculture. It's a big topic, and I think, you know, the former agriculture minister here had some good ideas, but continuity and implementation. On continuity, I was very impressed by the presentation at the end of yesterday's session by the former director of the Federal Inland Revenue Service, who said, whatever groundwork has been laid for you by your predecessors, you get the credit if you succeed. And so I would simply say to any next administration, whether it's a second term or a new administration, regardless, look at the groundwork that's been laid for you, and you'll get the credit if you succeed. We went from negative growth to barely 1%, now it's 2.5%. Look at what happened in 1982. The economy crashed for 2 decades. That's not what's happening now. So some work has been done, some changes have been registered. We're not in a great place, but the groundwork has been laid for the next administration, whoever that may be, to do better. And on implementation, again, I think I come back to this beating the drum on collective action. You don't have to have a perfect civil service. Indonesia had a weak civil service with corruption, poor education and training and so forth. But they did have enough incentive that they knew that they had to implement what was coming down from the top and that they had to deliver results. Delivering results is the one theme that we see in all these successful developmental states, whether it's the Brazilian or Mexican bureaucracy, or whether it's the Malaysian or Indonesian or Chinese bureaucracy. If you don't get the results, you're not going to advance, and you might face some unpleasant consequences in terms of, at a minimum, in terms of your professional advancement. But if you deliver, then you can advance. If people have poor salaries, poor infrastructure, and a constantly changing leadership, then there's no incentive for them to deliver.
Dr. Salami?
In terms of the civil service question, I think Peter Lewis has nailed it as far as I'm concerned. It's about what's the motivation to achieve results. Without that motivation, I don't think we are going to get very far. But I would also like to put 2 things on the table for consideration since we're talking about sustainable opportunity. The first, and which is driven by the question on a law, shall we say, institutionalizing the ERGP. I can see just how difficult that's going to be, because any new administration must also have the powers, if it's a new administration, to do what it thinks is correct. And also, you shouldn't forget, when you look at the actual performance of the ERGP against its targets, I think there's room for some review to see whether or not we actually are hitting the targets that we had set out to hit. Final point to put on the table. If Nigeria is going to grow sustainably, we cannot have a population that continues to grow at the pace that we say it is growing. It's very difficult. I forget which it is now, but I think it's Mexico. They were celebrating I think about a year ago, how the population of school children has stabilized. In other words, they are not having to build new schools to cater to that level of their population. For us, at the rate at which our population continues to increase, or at least that we say it continues to increase, the kind of expenditures that are demanded of us are not expenditures that are small, nor, in my view, sustainable. And so, for me, it's almost a taboo question, but my view is we are at a point where it's got to be up for discussion. Thank you.
Honourable Minister, closing remarks to you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just start by the notion that was brought up about third force. We have been engaging traditional rulers and religious leaders. Specifically, we have found out that to be able to address one of the great challenges that we identified in the ERGP, which is the growth in our population, that we need to engage these institutions. We've already started doing that, and we hope that with their support, we get to a point where we can come out with the policy that limits the number of children that the mother can have, because that is important for sustaining our life. And also, on the issue of maybe making a policy to have large corporates cooperate, government cannot make a policy in that manner, but we hope that with groups like this, the NESG, that we should be able to organize forums where large corporates can engage small SMEs and see how they can work together, because I'm sure the relationship will be symbiotic. Both parties will benefit from each other. The government cannot dictate to the private sector how they run their business or how they interface with any partner in the value chain of their business. The ERGP is not a new plan. We never claimed we made a new plan. It's a plan that distilled what was in the needs assessment, what was in the Vision 2020, what is in existing sector plans. So because we have taken previous plans and used them, we're sure that whatever administration comes also will continue with it. Which government will not want to continue to improve the infrastructure? Which government will not want to ensure that agriculture continues to grow? These are basic things. This is what we have in the ERGP. There are no-brainers. There are things that every government must do at the minimum. That is what we have in the ERGP. So we have no fears that it will be discontinued. You can change the name, you can change the cover, but the priorities will remain the same. And another thing that will ensure its continuity is that it was done with such large collaboration. We've got so many people involved that you just cannot ignore it. So it's not a government plan, it's a national plan. It's a plan that involves Nigerians, businesses, civil society. We had youth, we had the business segments, states and local governments. So it was a national plan, so you can't ignore it. You can change the name, but you can't run away from these priorities, because those are basic things that we must meet. And then finally, let me say that to Dr. Mansour, that the biggest problem we have up to today is policies are made, plans are made, but execution is weak. And that's one of the reasons why after rolling out the ERGP, we decided to have a focus lab. So we took 6 sectors to concentrate on. And in each ministry, there is a PI, a unit that is responsible for tracking on a daily basis the key performance indicators that have been defined for delivering on those targets. It's a model that is working so far. We have a midterm review that has just been kicked off, so that we'll see how it is performing. Of course, we have to enhance more the conditions for the public service to mitigate some of the risks that the public service itself poses to impunity.
Thank you very much to my panelists for our enlightening discussion this morning, sustainable economic opportunities. And I think if I can just borrow from Professor Lewis, there's a huge opportunity in Nigeria's population. You think about 170 million plus people, and if you use the terminology that you did, Professor, the ability to get large groups of people to work together towards a common goal, then the opportunities are endless. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Please, a round of applause for my panelists.
Very much. Thank you.